As I review every week, this first book is basically the basic foundation, neutralizing the waves of feeling, chitta, in order to be able to merge ourselves into that consciousness of Om and ultimately achieve that state of Samadhi. And Patanjali has given us certain things to be mindful of. And in the recent weeks, we've been talking about some of the obstacles that he raises to why we're not able to merge ourselves in that Om vibration. And I think each of us, if we're honestly introspect, we could see, yes, there are a lot of obstacles. And we could see that, yeah, if we read those obstacles, as we did last week, a week before, we can see that, yeah, I can relate to some of those. I can see I possess that one or this one or another one. But I want to caution us here is don't define yourself according to those obstacles. Sometimes we say, oh, we started going over them, all the different things that are holding us back. And it can feel like a bit of a weight, and we start defining ourselves by those. And it's just that same, a variation on that tendency that Paramhansa Yogananda encountered in many people, Christians, he would say to them, don't call yourself a sinner, or don't identify with your limitations. You have to be aware of your limitations, of course, in order to make the efforts and do the things that help you to overcome them. Keep them in mind. But remember, all of us have these, and we put our attention on solutions. And so here it is at Patanjali. We were talking about those common faults that we have, and when we ended that discussion, we're introducing that he then goes through a number of sloka stanzas discussing things that we can do. And I introduced one of the first ones. It was number 32, I believe, of the first chapter. And I began, but there's about 6, 7, 8 more of them. But I began with that one, and because he says, what we need to do essentially is we need to just simply concentrate harder. But of course, when I read that at first, when I was first reading the book or reviewing it again, you come to that, and I thought, oh, well, yeah, of course. That's like when you were in school, your teacher tells you, you just need to study harder. Well, that's not enough. Yes, we need to concentrate harder. And I'm not criticizing Patanjali here because he does go on. But if your reaction was like mine, study harder, concentrate harder. Of course, I've been doing my very best. But now, what else can I do besides that? And today, I'd like to go over stanzas 33 through 40. I'm not going to exhaustively go into each one of these, but I'd like to some impressions that I have when reading these, and maybe you share some of them as we look at what are the solutions that Patanjali offers us, things we might do. And I think you'll find, if you're a meditator, if you practice yoga, if you're a seeker, God seeker, you'll recognize these. But there are one or two that you may not have thought of, or he emphasizes, which I found interesting. And particularly the first one, that after he tells us to study harder, concentrate, he comes to the very next one. And I really like this one. And I say he lists the number of things here that are not necessarily in the order of importance. I think some are more important than others, but it's somewhat seemingly a random selection of things. But this first one, I thought if we go into it, it has larger implications. And he says, by cultivating attitudes, and remember here, how to overcome these obstacles to keep us from merging into the vibration of Om, into the light, into the divine, that block us from that oneness that we seek. in our spiritual quest. He says, by cultivating attitudes, I quote, of friendliness toward those who are happy, compassion for the unhappy, delight in the virtuous, and disregard for the wicked, the vrittis are dissolved in undisturbed calmness. Now, there's a lot in there. And one of the comments that I'd like to mention is in his commentary, Swami Kriyananda writes this, and I quote, "Our universal longing for happiness is an unbreakable bond that unites us all. The attitude of friendliness is, which is easier to feel toward those who are themselves happy, is essential to all who would feel God's grace in their hearts." In other words, the universal longing for happiness, that cultivating that attitude of friendliness. Now, that seems like a very somewhat prosaic things, but it's quite deep actually. And notice he says by cultivating. And you could say, how do we cultivate an attitude of friendliness, though to those, but it's not friendliness to just everybody, although I'm sure that's somewhat implied also, but it's an attitude of friendliness to those who are happy already. And because what we're doing is by cultivating, to cultivate our friendliness, we're giving of ourselves that attitude, we're rising ourselves to that attitude that's going to connect with those people already happy. And that's an extension of that quality that I put emphasis upon last week, which is the ability to choose our environment and putting ourselves in a good environment, or you could say putting ourselves in the company of those people who are going to be uplifting to us. The delight, you could say when it says the delight in the virtuous, is by saying putting yourself in that vibration of people who are virtuous, putting yourself in the vibration of those people who are already happy, and using those qualities of what it means to be friendly, friendship, friendliness. And it's so simple. It's so simple. But do we do it? That's the thing. And it's something that people sometimes think, well, I'm not friendly because they're not friendly to me. Or why should I be friendly when this world, when everybody's dog eat dog world? And of course, it's just changing our own attitude, and which we talk about over and over and over again. And it's such a simple thing to do in our social interactions. And even, I think, a hermit can have an attitude of friendliness as well. Friendly to the animals, friendly to the plants, friendly to the environment. It's a point, it's an attitude of a perspective that we take upon the world. And it's so very, very simple. And he lists this as one of the things that will help us to overcome those obstacles and that will help us to be able to merge into the vibration of Om. Now, you hear this exalted Om merging on the one hand, and you hear this very simple, prosaic quality to assume on the other. But here was a great saint putting the two together. One, if cultivated, leads to the other. But also, there's something else in there. He says, disregard for the wicked. Again, this has to go with avoiding negative influences, but it doesn't mean a lack of compassion, you see, but it's a distant compassion. As he said, the friendliness to those, compassion for the unhappy. And eventually you could say, ultimately you could say that means the wicked to a large, sometimes. Now, people are not necessarily wicked if they're unhappy. I'm not saying that. But you could say the other is true. People that are wicked are unhappy because wickedness, or though going against Dharma, or doing things that are going to be not only hurtful to oneself, but intentionally hurtful to other people, cannot lead to happiness. And I think we all have been, either are now or have been in our lives, familiar with people that are just, for whatever reason, it's like they're possessed of something. I sometimes think they're just unhappy people, and they try to make intentionally other people unhappy. People that try to wound other people, have cutting remarks, these sort of things. And you think, why are they that way? And it's a symptom, you might say, of their own inner unhappiness. And so, in a sense, we cannot always reach them successfully but we can have compassion for them. Compassion, prayer for other people, because until people of such disposition uplift themselves and open themselves to something, to want to rise above their wickedness or their unhappiness, it's very, very difficult. They're looking for something outside of themselves to make them happy, pleasure, circumstances, which can do it temporarily, but it doesn't really give them what they're seeking. So I know there's a tendency, I think, in all good-hearted people to want to help other people and get in there. Oh, I'm going to change. I'm going to get in there and work with that person, get them out of that. You have to use some discretion in this world, and to the degree you can help others. But remember, other people, sometimes their unhappiness is very magnetic, and it's pretty soon you're starting to say, yeah, that is pretty rotten. And then pretty soon you start to become unhappy too. So be careful with it. And potentially, of course, advises compassion and disregard. So keep that in mind. Now he goes on to say a second thing. This is, you could say, number 34. Friendliness. So simple. And then immediately he comes back with something very deep. He comes at us. He says, in other words, here, how to overcome obstacle. Calming, retaining the outward exhalation of the breath. Going breathless, in other words. So here you have being friendly, and everybody could be friendly, and go breathless. And there's, you might say, different ends of the spectrum on ordinariness. How many people do you know that can go breathless? Very, very few. But it's posited in the teachings of yoga that it is a potential. And Paramhansa Yogananda even says this, and when we give the Kriya technique to students, and he gave the Kriya technique to students, he said, practice Kriya, which is the calming of the exhalation of the breath, the retaining, the outward, but it's not retaining by force, or will, it's retaining by calmness until the breath no longer wants to breathe. And he said, practice Kriya until breath becomes mind. You see, you go so deep into concentration that we forget the breath, you might say, and that the breath ceases for periods of time. And those people whom have meditated for long periods over the years have often had periods of time where they've gotten so deep in their concentration that the breath has stopped momentarily. And it's not something to worry about because the breath comes back, but you can't force it. It comes through focused concentration upon something else, you see. The concentration upon stillness, concentration upon calmness, high aspiration. It says, oh, it left you, something was so beautiful. It just left me breathless. That's a natural reaction to high inspiration. And of course, the high inspiration we're speaking about here is that inner kingdom of the divine that comes naturally when the breath no longer want to breathe. I just want to be in that vibration. And so this, of course, is you could say, technical aspect, the practice of certain techniques be able to help us. And so I think Patanjali here, when he says, otherwise, calming and retaining outward the exhalation of the breath. Because you see, breathlessness, when it comes, doesn't come after the inhalation. You don't inhale and then just hold it there, because the body will only be able to do that for a certain number of minutes. But then you exhale, and the life force goes down in the spine. And instead of coming up again, it just rests. And if you go truly into the breathless state, then goes inward, and it rises inwardly in the inner astral spine. So these two, you could say, a dichotomy between these very technical and that very prosaic aspect of friendliness. But then he goes on, and he says, concentration of, this isn't one way to overcome obstacles, is by concentration of subtle sense perceptions can bring about steadiness of mind. Concentration of subtle sense perceptions. What does he mean by that? Well, we spoke about this last week. The senses, the five senses, have outward, but in yoga we speak about there's 10 senses. There's the five senses that are of the outward physical senses, and the power of those senses are also said to be another five senses, which is the inner experience of those senses inwardly, you might say, on the astral level of the astral body. The senses as they're experienced in the astral body. So consequently, we have the power of hearing, the chirping of the birds and the animals and the wind, other people. Inwardly, we can hear the sounds of the astral world. And when we withdraw the senses from the physical, we hear the astral experience of that. Same thing with we see, and then with the eyes, we see the inner light. That is the power that comes. And there's also smell and touch, smell and taste. And most importantly also, which Yogananda is, I'm repeating what I said last week, but the three of the five senses, the three most important are sound, sight, and touch. Touch is the most binding outwardly, and because it's related also to the sexual desire. But inwardly, it's also very important because it's feeling ourselves present in every atom of creation, which is what happens when we begin to inwardly, and the sense of expansion that comes inwardly when we can focus within. So what he's saying here, Patanjali is saying, go within. Learn to explore this world, not through the physical senses, but explore this world through the inner senses of the astral body. That's where our happiness lies, and in that, we expand into our higher reality. And of course, the way to do that is to get away from this, world of delusion, as Krishna said, into that inner world of the astral body, which is what we're trying to do when we practice yoga and do all of these other recommended techniques. He then goes, okay, and he says, concentrating upon the supreme, ever blissful light within. Of course, this goes back to, remember what he said, Ishvara, concentrated on that supreme divinity within ourselves. Now, one of the things that this called to mind when I was reviewing these, a couple things. One is, Patanjali lived and wrote these sutras 2,000 years ago, maybe up to 400 years ago, somewhere in that era, in the BC era, before AD. And at that time, the Vedic traditions that didn't include as much devotional attention as later developed as the Bhakti saints arose in the Indian religious tradition. And so you don't find in Patanjali, you don't find a bit of attention put. It's there, and we'll call attention as we go, but it's not as emphasized devotional aspect, the heart aspect, the awakening of the heart's natural love, as Swami Sri Yukteswar emphasized in his Holy Science. You don't find that element, but it is there because later on, historically, as other saints came, they began to emphasize that. In those days of Patanjali, even when you read the epics, the Mahabharata, the Ramayana, and others, Krishna, and Ram, they weren't deified to the degree that later the saints of the Bhakti era personified God very definitely, and worship of those forms. In ages prior to that, Patanjali's area was less of the focus. But it is there. And some people, when they teach Patanjali, when they talk about the Upanishads and the Vedic traditions, they sometimes neglect it. But Patanjali wasn't doing that. It just wasn't, he wasn't giving it the focus that was given later to the Vedic traditions and the scriptures. But here he says, concentrating on the supreme. But he says it. You see, it's a bit of an impersonal approach. Whereas later centuries, people were much more personal. But Patanjali approaches devotional and this focus upon the divinity in more of an impersonal way, the ever blissful and light within. And he emphasizes his expression of God as light. And this is, of course, the spiritual eye. We look into that light of the spiritual eye. And one thing, as I came upon the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda and began to study them, I found it surprising because he said this was a universal experience, and it is. People have this universal experience, different cultures, and it expresses in one way or the other. And I have always found it surprising that this universal experience, and this is a crucial element of the yogic path, is not mentioned and explored more in other traditions, other yoga traditions. Light is mentioned, of course, but the specifics of the spiritual eye, how Paramhansa Yogananda goes into it in quite depth and emphasizes it. It's very, very important as we work our way on the ladder toward self-realization. And he's gone into great detail about it. Why is it mentioned more in other traditions, and particularly in the teachings of yoga, other spiritual paths, other spiritual teachers? They just skim over it a little bit. And I think this is one of the unique things about Paramhansa Yogananda's teachings, that he doesn't skim over it. And I suspect it was because he lived it from direct perception. Now, I'm not saying others did not have that perception, but I think we have to realize Yogananda was a self-realized master. And that's not a commonality. And it points out, his ability to describe the experiential realities of the inner world and dismissed some falsities that other people have brought into it because it was direct perception. And I think that's in the tradition of Patanjali, who was speaking himself from direct perception. Now Yogananda goes on, or Patanjali goes on, and then adds, concentration upon that supreme inner light. Attunement, he goes on in number 37 to say, with the mind of an enlightened being, one who is free from attachment to all senses. We heard before, every moment in the company of a true saint will be a raft of illusion, even a moment. And of course, if one has the blessing to attune oneself to a living example, that's wonderful, great blessing. But attunement, even after that great one is past, attunement with that one will carry us across. He goes on, calmness by concentration, meditating on anything that one finds elevating in his consciousness. Again, environment. Surround yourself with things that inspire. Swami Kriyananda would say this in more depth because he was very sensitive to environmental influences in terms of beauty and harmony. And he says, look around your room, your meditation room perhaps, look around your home, any room in your house. Does it express who you are? Probably it does. Is it messy? Is it clean? Is it beautiful? He says, put nice things there, then put things in your surroundings that inspire you. Now you see this, many people, they'll put photographs or drawings or paintings of the saints or things, but it doesn't have to be overt like that. It's something that's beautiful that inspires you. I remember Swami in his writing here, somewhere in here, he wrote about people like to put beautiful paintings. And he says, that's inspiring. That's good. He says, but even that, think about it. Does it inspire you to a transcendent state of consciousness, or is it just something that reminds you of the beauty of the world at large? Now, there's nothing wrong with that. But he says, but even that's a little bit limiting if it attaches you to the world at large. You see, now I thought, well, that's a pretty high standard. But nevertheless, the point is we want to have something that inspires us to divine consciousness and to take us to a higher level. And, I've had pictures on my wall that I've enjoyed. And then after a time, I start to look at them. I says, wait a minute. And you might say that they've lost their taste a little bit after a while. Your mind wants to go beyond something. And look, pay attention to things. Or even the Swami was a stickler about this, is even the colors, the sounds, everything that you surround yourself with. Choose things that inspire and that elevate our consciousness, in other words. And the result of this, as Patanjali says, is gradually one's mastery of concentration extends from the smallest reality to the larger. Universal awareness from the smallest to the grandness, which is another way of saying omniscience or omnipresence, is what is the outcome of this. Now, it sounds quite simple in some ways, or it can sound quite complex, but let's sum that up. What is Patanjali recommending us? Develop calmness and concentration. And isn't that the essence of the spiritual path for those of us who follow the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda or any great master? Isn't that exactly what they all say? It's exactly what Master's teachings are all about. Summary, pick your environment wisely. Pick an environment that inspires us. Have the right attitude. Attune yourself to something that's uplifting. Attune yourself to the great ones. Attune yourselves to your guru. Transcend the breath. Practice Kriya until breath becomes mind. Expand and merge into the Om. Be friendly. Make friends. What Patanjali is describing is the path of self-realization as is taught by the masters of this path of Kriya Yoga. And it's all right there. And what the great ones of our tradition, masters of our tradition, have reawakened, you could say, the ancient tradition of Patanjali's teachings in the modern age, and have given it clothing that perhaps people in this age might better understand. Every great master comes at a time in history when the teachings and how they present the teachings resonate. And so you could see what Patanjali, they were resonating with you could say, society at that time. And I said he didn't emphasize the devotional side. Well, maybe that's what wasn't needed at that time, but some centuries later, when the great saints, the Bhakti saints came, they saw the necessity for that. And you could see even in somebody like Swami Sri Yukteswar brought out that spiritual side. And you could see in the teachings of Paramhansa Yogananda, all of these teachings of Patanjali there. And he emphasized also, plus meditation, service, devotion, and bringing those other elements, which are there, but not of emphasis. Just as every great teaching has all of these elements, but some are emphasized more than others, depending upon the time and the tradition in which it came. So here, Patanjali, just to sum up, is given our goal, merging in the infinite, the obstacles, why, what's preventing us, you might say, and now is a summary of solutions. Now, these are not the only solutions, because we know, I mean, I think most of us know something about the Yoga Sutras already, and we know there's much more. But he's basically summed up in this first book of the Yoga Sutras, Samadhipada, the first book, he summed up very directly and getting right to the point. He says, here's what yoga is about, here's where here's where this is going to take you, and here in summary are what's preventing you, and here's in summary of what you need to do to overcome that. And now there's going to be, and he's going to, I think we're going to wrap up this first book in the next week, and then he's going to move into another, you might say, another take on it. And so, but he started off the Yoga Sutras getting right to the point where what we need, what's happening, what's obstacles, and solutions on where we need to go. And so I'm going to let it be right there until next week, and we come back and we'll finish this chapter up, and I'll just look and see what we have here. Disregard for the wicked. Kindly give inputs on this. How to love yet disregard them. Well, that's Santosh. A good question. I mean, I think a very practical question too. And I think this is why I emphasize, maybe why Patanjali said this as well, but why I picked it out, is to have disregard, think about compassion. Now, I guess in the sense, disregard, I didn't take the time to look the Sanskrit words up to see if disregard, the word that Swamiji translated as disregard might have other meanings as well. I should have done that. I anticipated your question, in other words, but he's not saying to be mindless of other people. And think of that, because he does say compassion. Now, I don't think you can be totally disregarding and also be compassion, but he's saying I think it might be better interpreted to say disregard mean not to be engaging your active attention on those people who have that pull and going in other words, getting involved with them. You have to maintain a compassionate distance from them rather than engaging one's energies into them. And it goes back to that sloka of the Bhagavad Gita, which I think I mentioned last week or the week before, how it just takes time. People in a certain state of consciousness, in a state of adopting certain attitudes, you cannot reach them. If a person is determined, they're very unhappy, and they have all the reasons why they're unhappy, and their unhappiness, you can see, is because certain attitudes they have firmly adopted that are not going to lead them out of the labyrinth they find themselves in. And you try to, I know people like this, and I suspect we all do. One person I know is a very unhappy person, and I in the past have tried to offer some advice, and it leads to an argument immediately. no, and then because they're set on, and I think when he uses the word wicked, it's people that have an intentional. There's putting energy into it. They're putting energy into those things that really are making them happy, and it's why it's habit. It's a the pull of doing things that are not good for us has a magnetic pull, and they've gone into that, and they're firm. And sometimes you just have to back up and wait until there's an opening when you can give some constructive advice to help that person. And so in a sense, I don't really, I can't believe that meant disregard in the sense of our heart doesn't go out to them. But there has to be some reasonable effort on the part that person who is in ignorance of wanting to be helped before you can actually reach them. So I suggest, and this is the solution you might say for many things, is prayer. As you pray for somebody from a distance, you can help them. There are indirect ways you can help other people. Sometimes you have to use your other means, because maybe they may not listen to you, or you may actually threaten, because if you're a happy person, somebody who is unhappy sometimes won't like you because your happiness is threatening. If they've hunkered down into something that they're hanging on to, that's not good for them. So sometimes you may not be the best one to be able to help them. Maybe you want to help them, but you have to find a different instrument. For whatever reason, you're not the one. And so I think when he says disregard, it has to be balanced with the sense that he did mention compassion for the unhappy. And compassion is more than kindly thoughts. It's trying to find ways to help that person without getting sucked in to the aura of their unhappiness. And so I think there's this, that's a good question, because it's not black and white. This world is full of these gray areas of, Dharma is subtle, my lord, as Bhishma would say again and again. And so in the Gita. Yeah. Yep. Empathy and compassion in this regard. Empathy and compassion. Let's explore that. You can send your chat thoughts in too. Empathy and compassion. That's a good one. I'm going to have to think about that. What is the difference between empathy and compassion? I think compassion is a little bit more active than empathy. Empathy is the feeling, to be able to put yourselves in the shoes of somebody who has traversed that path. And I can feel empathetic, but then I think if to actually try to do something to help that person, I think is to feel empathy, but also to be compassionate, is to share my love for that person in an active manner of some, but that active can't necessarily and I think this is what we're being warned against here, can't always, sometimes it has to be done from a distance. But I do think that's a projection of those feelings of empathy to projection and embrace that other person that's unhappy in your heart. And like when we pray, we send that, and we try to actively send those prayers to somebody else, actively do something. And again, I say sometimes behind the scenes, we have to express our empathy in a compassionate way, but maintaining an element of detachment as well. We can't become attached and jump into the mud puddle too. We have to maintain that higher point that reaches out to people in a way that they can receive it. Now, this is not easy. You have to figure out how to do it. And some people put up a resistance that makes it really hard. And sometimes best thing we can do is just be compassionate from a distance and wait until the opening is there. Anyway, I'm going to leave it at that. And thank you there. I saw somebody put Yango. Yeah, Lango. Thank you for those. You put those the words up. Anyway, God bless all of you and thank you. And we'll look forward to seeing you again next week when I believe we're going to be able to wrap up this first book of the Yoga Sutras.